My grade for the confirmation process that we have just heard for the last couple of days, C plus, with grade inflation. It was a disaster. We learned so little. Not a single vote was changed. All we saw was partisan bickering. We saw questions asked that we knew the judge would not be able to answer. We can do a lot better. I'll talk about that on the Dirt Show. The hearings on the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett are coming to an end. We've heard her answer questions and not answer questions for several days now. What have we learned and what have we accomplished by having these hearings? Very, very little. We've learned that she's a very nice person. She's smart. She doesn't need notes. She can answer questions put by senators, some of them informed, some of them less informed, some good, some not so good. She's very good at that. She's thoughtful. We've learned her views on a couple of issues, not very many. We haven't even learned her views on whether she believes in climate control. She's gone further than most nominees in refusing to answer questions, but there are precedents for her refusal. It's Justice Ginsburg who said, I'm not going to give you any hints or any indications of how I'm going to vote on particular issues. That's fine. But what have we accomplished? Senate took time away from trying to deal with the virus and the economy and racial issues and devoted itself through the committee, but the Senate's not even in session, to having hearings. Has a single vote among senators changed? No, I don't think so. Before these hearings ever began, we were told the vote would be 51 to 49, that there were two Republican senators who would not be voting for the nomination, largely not on individual grounds, but on grounds that the nomination should not have been put forward and the Senate should not be dealing with the nomination on the eve of an election. It's now less than 3 weeks away from an election. This is the closest we've ever come to having a nomination to the Supreme Court confirmed on the eve of an election. We know that the Senate tried to establish a precedent 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland 8 months before an election, and the Republican-controlled Senate said, no, that's too close to an election, and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee said, quote my words back to me, if President Trump gets to make a nomination in the last year of his presidency, where the Republicans not going to let it go through, we're going to leave it to the next president. Well, the Democrats quoted his words, and Senator Graham said, no. Two things have happened since that time that make me not stand by my previous statement. One, it's now a situation where the president and the Senate are in the same party. That doesn't seem like a moral reason. That seems like simply an assertion of power. Second, he said, look at the way you treated Judge Kavanaugh. It was terrible, and I agree. I think it was terrible. I think the Democrats mistreated him horribly and based a lot of their questions on very questionable information about something he had done as a teenager. But that's no reason for changing the philosophy about when a president should nominate and the Senate should confirm. Look, I don't know who's right on this. It may very well be that the Republicans are right today, but if they're right today, they were wrong 4 years ago. And if they're wrong today, they were maybe right 4 years ago. I can only tell you the same rule should apply to Democrats and Republicans, and it shouldn't matter who's in control of the Senate. If the president makes a nomination on the eve of an election, there should be rules. The Senate should establish a rule. Maybe they can establish a rule that says no nomination will be considered after the conventions. That's really when the campaign begins in earnest. So that if a nomination is made in middle August, September, October, no, we'll delay it until the election of the new president. Or they could go back 6 months or whatever. But there should be a rule that applies equally to both sides. We don't have that rule. We just have the pure exercise of power. There are some who say, and I'm sympathetic to the view, that President Obama shouldn't have simply sat back and accepted the refusal of the Republican-controlled Senate to even hold hearings or consider the nomination of Merrick Garland. He might have done one of several things. He might have said, I'm making an interim appointment. The Senate isn't in session every day, and when the Senate's not in session, I'm going to appoint Merrick Garland to serve on the Supreme Court. We're going to have him sworn in, and he will take a seat in the Supreme Court as an interim justice, subject to being approved subsequently. That has happened before in our history. The other thing he might have considered would have been a far bolder and constitutionally more questionable move, and that is to say, look, the Constitution says the president shall nominate, and by and with the consent and advice and consent of the Senate, appoint justice to the Supreme Court. And the President, Obama, could have said, look, I have nominated, and the Senate has the right to consent or not consent. What they don't have the right to do is refuse to consider it. That's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says advise and consent. And if the Senate refuses to advise, refuses to consent, refuses to fail to consent by voting no, we're going to swear in the new justice. I have nominated him. The Senate has had a chance to advise me. The Senate has had a chance to consent. They have abdicated their responsibility under the Constitution. Mr. Justice Garland, welcome to the United States Supreme Court. Would the justices have accepted that? Would it have been challenged in court? Who knows? I suspect the reason that President Obama didn't do it is he thought, like most other people, that Hillary Clinton would be elected president and might as well give her the opportunity at that point to pick the Democrat of her choice. Maybe it would have been Merrick Garland. Maybe it would have been somebody else. But it would have been a nominee selected by the Democratic president of the United States. Well, it didn't turn out that way. How well I know that, because had Hillary Clinton been elected president, she would have been impeached by the Republicans. I would have defended her, and I would today be the hero of the Democratic Party. They built a statue to me on Martha's Vineyard instead of refusing to speak to me on Martha's Vineyard. I would have made exactly the same arguments, but I'd have a few more friends if Hillary Clinton had been elected. I supported Hillary Clinton. I voted for her. I contributed to her campaign. Nonetheless, I didn't believe that Donald Trump, who I voted against, could be constitutionally impeached, and so I made my principled argument, lost friends and even relatives over that issue. That's an issue for a different time, though it reflects closely on what we're talking about today, namely how hyperpartisan everything has become. And so the end result is going to be a 51-49 vote, if things go along as expected, to confirm a justice who will sit on the Supreme Court for the next perhaps 40 years. That's not a good situation. It really is going to raise questions about the political neutrality and objectivity and credibility of the United States Supreme Court. It was far better when justices were confirmed 98-0 or 100-0 or 96-2 or 4. It was much better then. It would be much better if we had a different system of selecting our justices. And I think this process that we're sitting through now is leading many people to think we have to revise the process. In many countries in the world, you have a commission of very prominent people, former judges, law professors, active lawyers, public servants, former senators, who make a recommendation to a president. Here are our 6 choices. Here are the 6 best potential justices in the United States who could serve on the court. Some may be Democrats, some may be Republicans, some may be conservative, some may be liberal. Here are the 6 best judges, the 6 best potential nominees, and you, the president, have to select from the 6. The president would obviously select somebody who was closest to the president's views on a range of issues, but it would be narrowed. Would Judge Barrett be on a list of 6? I don't know. Possibly yes, and possibly the same result would ensue. The other change that I think the framers of the Constitution made a serious mistake about, and should be changed, but it's not going to be easy to do without bipartisan support, and that is nominees to the Supreme Court should have to get a two-thirds vote for approval, not a simple majority. It used to be, when we had the filibuster and the cloture rule for Supreme Court justices, that in practice they needed 3/5. They needed 60 votes because that's what you needed to end debate. And if you didn't end debate, the process wouldn't go forward. That was changed. It was changed first by the Democrats for ordinary judges and then by Republicans for Supreme Court justices. We now have a 51-49 potential, indeed a 50-50 potential. You could have a justice serving for 40 years who has not received a majority of the sitting senators, if in fact it is the rule, as I think it's somewhat questionable, that the vice president can cast the deciding vote to confirm a nomination. But that's not the rule today. By the way, we could get back to that rule if merely a majority of the Senate voted for it. They could go back and vote to undo the elimination of the filibuster and cloture 3/5 rule and go back to a time when you needed at least 60 senators. What would that do? It would mean that the president would have to nominate a consensus candidate, somebody who received at least some support from some members of the opposing party. I think that would be a good thing. I suspect some of the justices who serve on the Supreme Court today would pass that test. Justice Breyer, I think, would have passed that test. He was very much a moderate, a centrist. He became, I think, more liberal as he served on the court. That tends to happen in some respects. People tend to, some of them move away from the middle, some of them move toward the middle. Once you put on the robes, it's not so predictable how you will act. In the case of Judge Barrett, I think it's pretty predictable. I think there's no doubt she is going to cut back on a woman's right to choose abortion. She will cut back on gay rights and gay marriage. Her views on precedent are not so clear in her writings. She has indicated she's closer to Justice Scalia and Thomas than she is for the mainstream of the court, and that is that she thinks a Supreme Court justice can and should overrule precedent if they think the original decision was clearly wrong. She talks about reliance interests and a range of other things, but she may very well become an activist judge when it comes to reversing old precedents with which she disagrees. So we have a sense that she will become a conservative activist on issues particularly that involve social concerns like abortion and gay rights and perhaps the Affordable Care Act, we're not sure, gun control, a range of other issues, racial discrimination. Clearly her own views on racial discrimination are clear. I believe her. She is not a racist. She does not believe in white supremacy. She does not believe in any kind of bigotry based on race. Her views on homosexuals are a little less clear, but I suspect in her personal life, she lives a life of complete equality and would be very comfortable having friends who were of a different sexual orientation from her. But it doesn't tell us how she's going to rule. Will she start right away and show her stuff with the Affordable Care Act, with some of the other cases that are pending, or will she move slowly as some of the justices have done over time? We don't know. There are other procedural changes that academics and pundits have been suggesting for years, and I support some of them. I strongly support term limits for justices of the Supreme Court. I've done that for years and years and years. An 18 or 20-year term seems to me about right. President should be able to appoint somebody for 18 years or 20 years. That means you get more appointments by more presidents. You'd have a more diverse court in that respect. Remember, we've had presidents who've gotten to make no appointments. Justice Carter got to make, President Carter got to make no appointments at all, whereas President Trump is going to get to make, it looks like, 3 appointments, and some have gotten to make even more in short periods of time, depending on the fortuities of age, retirement, and death, things that are hard for presidents to control. So I think term limits, but you'd need a constitutional amendment for that, we think. There are those who argue maybe Congress can impose term limits. Look, I think we're going to see these things tested out because the most likely prediction over the next 3 months, I've said this before, I'm just looking at the polls, I'm not giving you my preferences, I'm just predicting what I think will happen. In fact, the most likely outcome will be after November 3rd, after January 20th, The presidency may well be in the hands of the Democrats. The Senate may very well be in the hands of the Democrats, and the House will certainly be in the hands of the Democrats. That means that you can have political changes. You could probably have a vote that brings back the 60 vote requirement. That's clear. Could you have a vote imposing term limits? Probably not, although there are some scholars who say maybe you can. I doubt that would survive constitutional muster if it were in fact challenged. One question would be who would challenge it. Maybe justices would simply accept it and there'd be no challenge. I don't think anybody else could challenge it if the justices went along with it. So we may see some changes. We may also see some very, very far-reaching legislation testing the Commerce Clause, which was talked about a lot at the hearings. We may see the Democrat-controlled Congress enact a pro-choice national statute saying it is in the national interest of Americans to allow women to choose abortion so as to avoid the need for them to travel from state to state, burden our medical systems in some parts of the country more than other parts of the country, risk their health in making the travel, impose equality because only people with some degree of financial security can travel from state to state. We may see a statute like that. We may see a statute also saying that gay marriage is a national interest. That would be a harder one, I think, to uphold constitutionally, but it would at least be something that could be done. So I think we're going to see a very activist Congress and a very activist president trying to limit the impact of the Supreme Court. And it's going to be interesting to see how the Supreme Court reacts. The justices, led by the new justice, have said, we're not activists. We wait for cases to come before us. We know that isn't true. We know that there are litigation lobbies. There are groups of people funded by very wealthy people on both sides of the aisle who bring cases to the Supreme Court. They don't wait for somebody to be injured. They don't wait for a litigant. They go and they search for litigants. They find litigants. They bring cases challenging the Affordable Care Act, challenging the Supreme Court's decision on gay rights, challenging abortion expansion. We know that these cases are going to be brought. We know there are going to be activist litigants. The question is, will the Supreme Court accept a role as being the accessory to those litigation activists and say, we're going to take this case. We know that Justice Alito did that. There were some very good demonstrations yesterday, particularly by Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, showing how Senator Alito planned to have a particular decision involving union rights overruled. That was his agenda. He laid it out in opinions. The court welcomed the case. The litigants decided deliberately to throw the case. They went to the district court and said, we want to lose. We went to the Court of Appeals. We want to lose. We want to get this case to the Supreme Court. Well, Justice Scalia is still sitting on the Supreme Court. Well, they failed. Man plans, God laughs. Justice Scalia died. The case was affirmed 4-4. Then they went back. They did it again. They got a do-over. And this time they won 5-4. So the idea of the Supreme Court as a passive institution simply waiting for people who have been harmed to come and bring their cases, and the Supreme Court will just call balls and strikes. Nonsense. That's not the way it operates in the current environment. So I think we're in for some very interesting times if the predictions turn out to be true. If the Democrats get to control two branches of government and the Republicans get to control the third branch of government, the judiciary, we're going to see a lot of switches. We're going to see liberals become judicial restraint activists. We're going to see those who are on the right, the conservatives, becoming advocates of more judicial activism rather than judicial restraint. And we're going to see a lot of debate probably in the next year or two about how to change the process by which justices get nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court. So Senator Klobuchar made an interesting statement this morning. She said, turning to the empty seat that Judge Barrett had been sitting in, she said, "This should be your judge, not Donald Trump's judge, meaning you're the American people. I don't think that's the right approach. This should not be anybody's judge. This should be the best, most qualified potential justice to the Supreme Court. I end this morning with something I've said before. When Herbert Hoover was president of the United States, perhaps the most qualified person ever to run for president, who turned out not to be a great president because of the Depression, but super qualified, brilliant, brilliant man. When he got to nominate the replacement for Oliver Wendell Holmes, he showed a list to one of the senators, and the list had Justice Cardozo's name on it, but he was the 10th on a 10-person list. And Senator Borah said, "Mr. President, it's a great list, but you gave it to me upside down. Justice Cardozo should be your nominee." And the president responded essentially, "Yeah, but he's a Democrat. He's from New York. I don't need New York. I already have 2 justices from New York. He's Jewish. There's already a Jew on the Supreme Court." And the Senator Borah said, "He's not from New York. He's from the United States of America. And anybody who focuses on his ethnic or religious heritage isn't worthy of giving you an opinion. And he is the best sitting judge in the United States of America. So it doesn't matter what his political party is." And President Hoover nominated Benjamin Cardozo, the best judge in the United States, to replace one of the best justices in history, Oliver Wendell Holmes. We're never going to see that again unless we see structural changes, unless we see ideological and political changes, unless we go back to a time when justices of the Supreme Court were nominated not because of the anticipation of how they will vote on particular cases, but because these were people who would serve for many years during times when we have no idea what the issues are going to be. And we want justices who have the flexibility of mind, who have the character, who have the brilliance to be able to resolve issues that we can't even anticipate today. So for me, very disappointing few days. The few areas that she could have been pressed on, she was not pressed on. Her view on recusal. She could have been asked hard questions about that because she wrote about it. Would she recuse herself if her fundamental views, religious views, ideological views, if her views were totally inconsistent with the Constitution and the law on issues of abortion and capital punishment? She wrote in 1998 that she might have to recuse herself, but she wasn't pressed hard enough on that issue. She was asked mostly questions that the person asking the question knew she couldn't answer. The reason for asking the question was to make points, to get her not to answer, so that they could say, "See, she didn't answer this, she didn't answer that." That's a good point to make, but it would have been so much better if they had asked her lots and lots of questions about things she had written about and could have no excuse not to answer. So we haven't learned anything. I haven't learned anything new. I did learn that she's a nice person, and she seems like a wonderful human being. I'd love to have her as a neighbor. I'd love to be friendly with her family. We've learned all of that, and that's part of what goes into making a great holder of any office. But we didn't learn what we're supposed to learn in the nominating and confirmation process. So my grade for the confirmation process, C+ with grade inflation. We can do better. We should do better. We must do better. That grade, by the way, the C+ with grade inflation, doesn't represent my political views or my own personal ideological views. I would have given the Democrats the same grade had it been a reverse, had the shoe been on the other foot, had we had hearings like this conducted by a majority of Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. Because on this show, on the Dirt Show, you're never going to hear ideology. You're never going to hear my political views put before my constitutional views. So today you've heard my structural constitutional views on the failure of the confirmation process, and I want to hear your views about this process and other issues as we continue hearing from your voices on the Dirt Show. Now we're going to hear from your voices, your questions, your comments, your criticisms. Mariago from Pennsylvania.
At the end of your recent interview on the Megyn Kelly Show podcast, you remarked that you're proud of everything you've done in your life. Does that include the time you used your influence to get a celebrity friend's daughter into her first choice college by contacting the college's president after she couldn't get admitted on her own? Thank you.
That's a great question. I would say I'm not particularly proud of that moment. I know that college presidents do get a few discretionary admissions. She was qualified, and she did well actually in college. She just probably wasn't as qualified as other people, but as I think about it now, probably it's not something I should have done because maybe she took the place of somebody who was more qualified. I was actually told that when the president makes his three or whatever choices, it doesn't take it away from anybody else. It's just three people added to the class. But you got me. You're right. I probably shouldn't have done it. It's a good point. Here's our next caller.
What mechanisms does SCOTUS have under the Constitution to protect itself from a court-packing scheme to enlarge its seats from the original 9? How do we do that under the Constitution? And what is SCOTUS itself? What can it do to protect itself? Thanks so much, and I hope everything goes great.
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Of course, the original number of the Supreme Court justices was not 9. It was much less. It became 9, and then it became 10, then it became 9 again around the time of the Civil War shortly thereafter. But it's been 9 now for many, many, many years. There's nothing the Supreme Court could do. The Supreme Court has no power to determine its own number. That's up to Congress to decide. It's also up to Congress to decide their salaries and how many law clerks they get. You can't cut the salary of justices once they've gotten their salary, but you could decide that they get no salary, that justices should serve pro bono. Obviously, Congress is not going to do that because the next step would be to make Congress serve pro bono without any salaries. But there's nothing you can do about the number of justices. The number of justices will be determined by Congress, and the Supreme Court would simply have to accept that. I just hope it doesn't come to that. Our next caller is Ellis.
I enjoyed reading your book you wrote about Thomas Jefferson, a signed letter you found at the Argosy bookstore, and I was wondering if since then you've obtained any other interesting historical artifacts you'd be willing to tell about.
Boy, you have asked me the best question. You got about 3 or 4 hours. I'm a historical artifacts collection buff. Every time I have a chance to buy something that's an amazing reflection of our history, our culture, I do. I recently bought a letter written by Theodor Herzl, one of my heroes, the founder of Zionism, a little postcard that he wrote to his daughter as he was traveling to try to establish the state of Israel. I bought another postcard by Sigmund Freud, in which he wrote to his nephew, who it turned out I knew his nephew, lived in Cambridge. A day doesn't go by that I'm not online looking to buy a historical artifact. The Jefferson Letter was amazing. My son and I were walking in New York, and I think my son said, "Why don't we drop by the Argosy bookstore? They always have interesting things." So I walked in and I said, "Do you have any artifacts from the Brooklyn Dodgers?" Because I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan. And they said, "No, we have nothing, but we just got a new letter from Thomas Jefferson. You might be interested." And I looked at the letter. I couldn't believe it. It was a great letter about freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I immediately bought it. I bought it on a Friday. By Monday, I had written 12,000 words of a book that I was going to write called Finding Jefferson, about how I found this letter. And I get into a dialogue with Thomas Jefferson. So the book is called Finding Jefferson. And if any of you out there have any artifacts you want to sell to me, I'm always buying. I'm always available. I have a little museum in my house, and I love having old artifacts. You know, the idea you can touch something in your hand that was held by Thomas Jefferson in the White House in the year 1800, on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That letter is one of the great treasures. I also own a very early copy of the Declaration of Independence that I recently purchased. Obviously, it's not the original signed by the signers, but Congress authorized replicas to be done very early in its history as the Declaration was disintegrating. And I now own one of those great early copies. And on July 4th, I take it out and I read it to my family. They get a little bored, but they have to listen to the entire Declaration of Independence. I don't read the names of all the signatories, just the Declaration itself. So, yeah, I love history. I love American history. I love Jewish history. I love world history. I have signed letters from Winston Churchill, from virtually everybody who I admire. I try to get something that they owned and touched and wrote. Our final call today comes from Mike from New Orleans. Great question about cameras. To the question, are cameras good or bad? My answer is yes. They are both good and bad. They're good in the sense that they give us an opportunity to view our legislators. I, in fact, would put cameras in the Supreme Court as well. I think we have a right to see our justices in operation. But certainly when you get to elected officials, we see a lot of posturing. But it also shows sometimes how inept some of the senators are at asking questions. Some of them come off great. Some of them come off okay. Some of them do not come off well at all. And we, the voters, are entitled to see that. At the hearings this week, the issue of cameras in the courtroom came up as well. I'm a supporter of cameras in the courtroom, though I understand the negative implications. I've argued, 250 appeals. A few of them have been televised. I couldn't even tell you now which ones were and weren't. I didn't notice. I was so involved in answering the questions of the judges or the justices that the fact that there was a television camera recording what I was saying didn't influence my presentation, but it may very well have influenced some of the questions that were asked. So I think it's a knife that cuts both ways. I think on balance, having every process of government subject to viewer evaluation is a good thing. On the other hand, I understand the negative implications of encouraging people, whether they be judges or litigants or senators or members of Congress, to posture and to use it as an opportunity to politic for votes. So double-edged sword. For me, on balance, I favor public's right to know and the public's right to see and hear. So this was the Durst Show. You've heard my views. You'll hear my views repeatedly. I think we've come to the end of the discussion of the confirmation process. We will have the vote on the confirmation of Judge Barrett. Likely it will be voted 51-49, but we'll come back in future episodes of the Durst Show and we'll talk about this and all the other issues that affect your life, and I will keep my promise, you will never be bored. An important part of the Durst Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short and I'll answer them all on the Durst Show.